Flying aces were the rock stars of World War I, knights of the sky, loved and admired around the world, receiving dozens of love letters a day, their pictures adorning the bedroom walls of millions of teenage girls. Their names are immortal: the Red Baron, Billy Bishop, Eddie Rickenbacker, Werner Voss, Oswald Bulk, Albert Ball, Max Immelmann, René Fonck, Georges Guynemer, Charles Nungesser, and more. They were perceived as true gentlemen, fighting man to man, with respect between pilots transcending borders. While that perception may have been somewhat true early in the war, by the later stages it was anything but that. Flying most often in formation and attacking with machine guns, the life expectancy of pilots was frequently measured in hours, and a perfect kill was when the enemy never saw you coming. As the great empires of Europe went to war, so did their colonies throughout the globe. France brought Zouaves from Africa to Flanders. Britain brought in Canadians, South Africans, Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and Gurkhas from India. In Africa, German colonial troops, the Schutztruppe, fought for their existence against Belgian, British, French and Portuguese attackers. Russia brought troops from Siberia to Europe. The Chinese Labour Corps worked behind the lines on the Western Front, and war flared throughout the Middle East. Millions of men from every corner of the globe fought in what was truly the First World War. No other war in history had brought such change so quickly as World War I. It's been said that between 1914 and 1918, the world went from 1870 to 1940. And in many ways, it is true. Men rode into war on horses and rode out of it in tanks. In August 1914, old school met new as infantry marched out en masse in brightly coloured uniforms against machine guns. The new school won. Airships and airplanes sailed the skies. Submarines and battleships prowled the seas. And the biggest gun of all, the Paris gun, fired shells that were the first man-made objects to reach the stratosphere. Stormtroops, the creeping barrage, chemical warfare, the psychological warfare of bombing civilians far from the front. These were the hallmarks of the First World War. Even things we take for granted today, like the zipper, radio communications, sanitary napkins and soya sausages, became everyday conveniences because of the war. And medicine made greater progress in those 4 years than at any other time or after. As the victors redrew the map after the war, many countries we know today emerged. The post-World War was, in every respect, a new world. Before the Great War is often described as tranquil and peaceful. But in the decades before the Great War broke out, there had been Balkan Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, terrorism, assassinations, and increasing demands for civil rights and self-governance throughout the empires. And so, when Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot, at first it barely caused a ripple. In Britain and France, it was seen as just another political assassination in a far-off corner of Europe where things like that happened. It was certainly not a reason to go to war. But all the nations who went to war did have other reasons, and as it turned out, that assassination was the perfect foil to make the dominoes fall. Austria-Hungary wanted an empire to the Mediterranean. Russia wanted influence in the Balkans. Germany feared Russian economic expansion and also wanted a larger global empire. France wanted back the lands it had lost to Prussia. Britain wanted to curb German expansion, especially naval and colonial expansion, while preserving its own worldwide empire. Some leaders also saw war as a way to silence the protests and boost nationalism. But it wasn't just political. War was big business. Someone would have to supply the troops, to produce the weapons, ammunition and uniforms. Those someones would make fortunes. It's no secret that the war created tens of thousands of millionaires, and it's no secret either that many business leaders urged their governments to war in 1914. The sheer force of the German spring offensive in 1918 had stunned the British, pushing them back almost to Amiens before they could stop the Germans at the outskirts of the city. Amiens, as a logistics centre and railway hub, was vital to the British war effort and had to be held. The Germans captured the neighbouring village of Villers-Bretonneux, and Amiens was bombed. But the German supply lines were stretched too thin to capitalise on their success, and a British-Australian counterattack drove them away. But the Germans weren't finished. On April 24th, a German A7V tank appeared and broke through the British defensive lines, threatening Amiens. 3 British Mark IV tanks challenged it in the first tank-on-tank battle in history, and held them at bay long enough for a squadron of Whippet tanks to appear. They drove off the Germans, and the Amiens sector was saved. The châteaux of France were the traditional homes of the nobility. Some resembled villas, others were more like castles. During the war, many of these fell into German hands, which then would serve as luxurious quarters for generals and high-ranking staff. Captured enemy officers and ace pilots enjoying the privileges of rank and title were often housed in these salubrious retreats. However, as the war gathered pace and the front spread, many soon became the scenes of vicious battles. By 1918, many of them were in ruins, much like the old aristocracy itself. After the Ottoman Empire failed to take the Suez Canal from the British in early 1915, the British pursued them into the desert, and a new front was created that lasted till the very end of the war. Desert fighting was very different from the battlefields of Europe, but tanks made their appearance even here at the Second Battle of Gaza. The goals were Damascus, Aleppo, and the prevention of an operational Berlin-Baghdad railway for the Central Powers, who had already connected Berlin with Constantinople. The British also helped the Arab revolt against the Ottomans that grew in strength throughout the region. When Damascus fell, the revolt was complete. The lasting result was British control over Palestine and French control over Syria and Lebanon. The lines drawn by this conflict are still in dispute to this day. When the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers in early November 1914, the British Empire feared for the security of its oil wells, pipelines, and refinery at Abadan near the Persian Gulf. They moved to capture the Ottoman-controlled Al-Faw Peninsula, and the ancient fortress of Fao was the main Ottoman stronghold there. Within days of the Ottomans joining the war, a British naval fleet was in position and a joint marine attack with the Indian Expeditionary Force was launched. The walls of the fortress were breached by heavy artillery, allowing the Indian-British forces to seize the fortress in bloody hand-to-hand combat, taking the port of Fao the next day. This was the first action of the Mesopotamian campaign, which continued until the capture of Baghdad in 1917. The victory relieved all British concerns about the safety of their oil. The shadowy depths of the Argonne forest provided the setting for the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This was part of the final Allied offensive that ended with the armistice on November 11, 1918. Its objective was to take the railway hub at Sedan, breaking the German supply network to France and Belgium. It would be no easy task. The deep forest was a labyrinth, teeming with German machine gun defences. And while there were well over 1 million American troops attacking, they were inexperienced and would face nearly 500,000 dug-in Germans, battle-hardened and resolved to hold their ground. Once Italy joined the war, the Italian and Austro-Hungarian navies faced each other across the Adriatic Sea in a deadlock. The Italian navy was superior in numbers and quality, but the Albanian and Dalmatian coastal harbours were better fortified and easier to defend. Both sides concentrated their strategies on fast torpedo and gunboat battles. Highly mobile and able to threaten either navy attempting to leave harbour, they inflicted heavy damage using these raider tactics. Italy developed the MAS, the anti-submarine motorboat. Made of plywood and only useful in calm water, they were still faster than any other warship and carried depth charges, torpedoes and mines. Submarines harassed unwary steamers, and seaplanes and torpedo boats harassed submarines. There were coastal raids back and forth on both sides, but it was the Allied naval blockade of the Adriatic that perhaps had the strongest effect on this front. It effectively halted Austrian shipping and prevented them from adequately resupplying their empire, which exacerbated their food and material crisis as the war dragged on. Monte Grappa occupied a strategic position on the Assaggio Plateau, overlooking the gateway of the plains of Veneto. Whoever controlled its heights controlled the area, and it saw its share of battles during the war. In 1917, the Italians halted the Austrian summer offensive at the very peak, and by December, the Austrians had been pushed off the mountain. Further attempts to take the mountain in the spring and summer of 1918 also failed, and Monte Grappa, by then the symbol for Italy's defense, would play a huge part in the final Italian offensive of the war on Vittorio, Veneto. Brutal fighting finally forced the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army and its retreat in late October 1918. Two-thirds of the casualties of the offensive were inflicted around Monte Grappa itself. With Russia out of the war, Germany was free to transfer hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened troops to the Western Front to try to break the stalemate there and hope to win the war through a decisive final victory. The Americans had not yet arrived in force, and the British and French were exhausted from the battles of 1917. It was time to strike. Operation Michael would be the first battle of the new offensive. The plan was to punch through the British Fifth Army and outflank the Third near the endless, devastated no-man's land of St. Quentin, with the aim of finally capturing the vital Allied railway hub of Amiens. This was to be the mother of all battles. It began with 1 million artillery shells raining down on the British in 5 hours. Headquarters, communications and artillery were destroyed. Following the surprise and terror, German stormtroopers overwhelmed the British defences, ripping a gap over 60 kilometres long in their lines. This was only the beginning of the Kaiserschlacht. The importance of the Suez Canal to the British in the war cannot be overstated. Having millions of troops from India, Australia and New Zealand heading to Egypt and Europe, and also British oil from Persia being shipped through the canal, it was a vital supply line. If captured by the Ottoman Empire, it would severely disrupt British troop and supply routes and put the entire Eastern Mediterranean in Ottoman hands. In early 1915, they crossed the Sinai Desert to attack the canal. This near impossible accomplishment was enabled by German engineers going in advance to dig water wells through the desert. When the Ottomans reached the canal, they knew they only had 4 days to seize it before running out of supplies. Ottoman artillery would be vital for the attack to have any chance of success. And diversionary attacks all along the canal would be launched in the hopes of confusing the defenders. The Ottomans would attack the Suez Canal several times during the war, but never took it. The British counterattacked and pushed the Ottomans back into the Sinai Desert. When the modern combustion engine was first developed in the 1880s, few realized how much it would change the global economy. But over the next decades, in every shipyard, it became obvious that oil power was superior to coal in every way. A motor could now reach full power in 30 minutes instead of 6 hours. It required a fraction of the men to run it, and a ship's range increased fourfold. Even before the war, the dreadnoughts of the mighty British Navy had begun to convert to oil power, but oil was to be found far from British shores. Much of the British war effort in the Middle East was to protect British oil supplies, the Suez Canal transport route, and to take or destroy the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, Germany's oil supply line to the Ottoman Empire. As the war progressed, and the airplane, the car, the submarine, and the tank were produced in greater and greater numbers, oil became ever more important. The Battle of Caporetto in October 1917 nearly broke Italy. They took 300,000 casualties as German and Austro-Hungarian forces crashed into the Isonzo River Valley. 1 year later, the situation was different. The German army was in retreat, Bulgaria had surrendered, the Entente was pushing through the Balkans and the Middle East, and the Italian Army Chief of Staff had been sacked for his incompetence and replaced by Armando Diaz. Austria-Hungary was on the verge of collapse, and if Italy was to gain any territory, they would have to act swiftly before the war ended. Diaz launched a final offensive to capture Vittorio Veneto. The fighting was brutal, but eventually the combined Entente forces had the demoralized Austrians in full retreat. They took Trent and Trieste as the Habsburgs' empire began to collapse. The Armistice of Villa Giusti took effect on November 4, 1918, and ended warfare on the Italian front, 4 days after the end of the last bloody battle of the Great War. The Allies' 100 days offensive began with the Battle of Amiens. Their objective was to capture the vital railway hub at Sedan, beside the Meuse River. This location was vital for the German army to move supplies and support to its forces north of Verdun. The job of taking Sedan fell to the fresh American troops under the command of General Blackjack Pershing and to the French. They would supply artillery, tanks, and air support. The Germans held on grimly, but with their reserves dwindling, they had no choice but to withdraw. By November 5th, Allied artillery was within range of the railway lines. With 1.2 million American soldiers involved, the Meuse-Argonne offensive is to this day the largest battle in the United States military history. Though a success, it was enormously costly. The fighting in the heavily fortified terrain of the Argonne forest has been described as hell on earth, and for the Americans, it was the bloodiest battle of the war. The German Spring Offensive, also known as the Kaiserschlacht, was a series of German attacks on the Western Front in the spring of 1918. Germany had a manpower advantage over the Allies since Russia had left the war following the revolution. But German High Command realized that this would disappear as millions of troops began arriving from the USA. If Germany were to win the war, they needed to strike immediately and strike hard. German stormtroops would lead the attack. This was the first use of German tanks and an artillery bombardment so massive it could be heard in London. The Germans broke through the Allied lines, advancing further than anyone had in the West since 1914. But as the weeks went on, they were unable to move supplies and reinforcements forward quickly enough to continue the advance. Though they had made great gains and inflicted devastating casualties on the enemy, they did not achieve final victory, and the German army was left exhausted and depleted. Maria Boczkarova had been a soldier since 1914, after personally petitioning the Tsar to be allowed to fight, as women were not allowed to officially join the Imperial Russian Army. Then, in 1917, when the February Revolution began to tear that army apart, and many war-weary men simply deserted, the now decorated war hero Boczkarova sent a request to the Minister of War Alexander Kerensky to form the first women's battalion of death. While Kerensky saw the strong propagandistic potential of the patriotic death battalions, Boczkarova was determined to create a viable fighting force, equal to those of men and exemplary in their willingness to die for Russia. Of the 2,000 women who initially volunteered, only 300 completed Boczkarova's tough training regime. Her battalion occupied active frontline trenches and went over the top during the Kerensky offensive in July 1917. They fought well, but suffered heavy losses. Boczkarova herself was wounded by shell fire. Other battalions were formed after this, but recruits were often discouraged by the constant hostility of men at the front, many of whom looked down on them simply for being women. Others saw them as tools of the war ministry, and by the end of the year, the October Revolution, they had been dissolved. An estimated 5,000 women in total served in these units, though only Boczkarovas saw frontline action in the First World War. General Alexei Brusilov had only recently been appointed commander of the 4 Russian armies on the southern half of the Eastern Front, but he already planned an offensive against the Central Powers to take place in concert with Britain and France's upcoming offensive on the Western Front in the summer of 1916. More competent and aggressive than his colleagues, Brusilov hoped to break the battle-weary and weakened Austro-Hungarian forces in Galicia with one decisive blow. He ordered his staff officers to supply the artillery with more shells than ever before, to provide meticulously detailed maps and accurate intelligence about the defences. And he also planned to implement brand new shock troop tactics in the attack. On the 4th of June, massive concentrated artillery bombardments shook the Austro-Hungarian lines, while diversionary attacks confused the defenders. Equipped with hand grenades and supported by machine guns, the shock troops broke into and through the demolished trenches and were immediately backed up by the reserves. There were breakthroughs all along the 250-mile front, and it seemed the Austro-Hungarian resistance would collapse as their soldiers were in full retreat. Brusilov urged the northern Russian commanders to attack as well, to tie down the Germans before they could be shifted to the south and reinforce the Austrians. But the northern commanders delayed again and again, and the Germans were able to send the badly needed assistance to their stricken ally. The Brusilov offensive was a major Russian victory, but with total casualties on both sides as high as 2 million, it was the deadliest battle of the war, and Russia had missed a very real chance to knock Austria-Hungary out of the conflict. In 1914, Russia still bore scars from its humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, and the numerous workers' strikes of the 1905 revolution gnawed at the foundations of Tsarist rule. The autocratic Tsar Nicholas II was unwilling to change Russia's obsolete political system, one which widened the gap between the poor and oppressed, the majority of the people, and the small minority of bourgeoisie and aristocratic landowners. The prospect of an external enemy, however, seemed to unite all of Russia once again behind its leader. The rising pan-Slavic ideology fitted together with Russia's foreign policy that sought to gain influence in the Balkans and to extend its reach along the Black Sea and towards Constantinople. Russian geopolitical ambitions there naturally clashed with the interests of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Russia had a population of nearly 170 million, but over 90% of them lived and worked in agricultural societies, and nationwide industrialization had not been possible without foreign help and money. Germany had turned its back on Russia to strengthen its ties with Austria-Hungary. Consequently, Russia arranged economic deals with France, which in turn led to a military alliance between the two. These alliances meant that a war between the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian empires over issues in the Balkans would inevitably drag in France and Germany. A war that not even the deep affinity between the two royal cousins, Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas, would be able to stop once mobilization began. The strongest military opposition to Bolshevik rule formed in the Donbass region under the former Imperial Russian generals Anton Denikin and Pyotr Krasnov. Krasnov's well-trained Don army, fighting for the White Russians, was around 45,000 men strong and equipped with 600 machine guns and 150 artillery pieces, and they set their sights on the city of Tsaritsyn, a vital strategic asset. With its large railway hub, road connections and communication network, it not only supported a vast industrial capacity, Tsaritsyn basically controlled the whole northern Caucasus. In the autumn of 1918, White Russian troops attacked from the south, while the Don Cossacks to the north cut the city off from Moscow. The Bolsheviks, the Red Army, were pushed to the west bank of the Volga River, but were unwilling to give up the city. Their military committee under Joseph Stalin and Kliment Voroshilov rallied the workers of the city and established a defensive perimeter with multiple trench lines and barbed wire emplacements. Again and again, the White Russians attacked, but were unable to break through. The battle continued throughout 1919, with reinforcement on both sides. The Red Army's Steel Division broke through from the north, while the Whites were strengthened by the armoured train United Russia and a British tank mission. The Tank Corps nearly captured the city, with a single tank breaking through into the city centre, but the lack of supplies, particularly fuel, halted the advance. In 1920, the Red Defenders were finally relieved by reinforcements from Moscow and were strong enough to push the Whites out of the city for good. To honour Stalin's resolute defence of the system, Tsaritsyn's name was later changed to Stalingrad. The commander of the southwestern front of the Imperial Russian Army, General Alexei Brusilov, launched a colossal assault against the Austro-Hungarians in Galicia on June 4, 1916. The offensive was one of the first to utilize revolutionary shock troops and infiltration tactics on a mass scale, attacking weak points of the Austro-Hungarian defenses to achieve breakthrough. The German army, among others, would copy the Russian infiltration tactics for later attacks. The Brusilov offensive is known as one of the deadliest in world history, and is the only World War I campaign to be named after an individual commander. It broke the back of the Austro-Hungarian army and had pushed it back to the Carpathian Mountains by September 1916. But due to poor coordination with other Russian commanders, the offensive failed to fully knock the Austro-Hungarians out of the war. Despite the massive tactical success, it cost the Russian Empire 1 million casualties and failed to bring about a conclusive victory against the Central Powers, which left the Russian population disillusioned and susceptible to revolution. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated after the 1917 February Revolution, and the following provisional Kerensky government was overthrown by Lenin and his Bolsheviks in November. Russia was thrown into an enormously bloody and costly civil war between mainly the Bolshevik Red Army and the opposing White Army and its multinational allies. One of the key battles between the Reds and the Whites was the struggle for control of the city of Tsaritsyn on the Volga River between 1918 and 1920. Tsaritsyn changed hands several times during the Civil War and was temporarily occupied by the White Army in June 1919, when Major Ewan Cameron Bruce of the British Army spearheaded the capture of the city with a single Mark V tank. In January 1920, Stalin led a successful Red Army recapture of the city, forcing the remnants of the Whites to retreat towards the Crimean Peninsula. In 1925, Tsaritsyn was renamed Stalingrad, and during World War II, it would once again be under siege in one of the bloodiest battles in history. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto was launched on the 24th of October 1918 and saw the Italian army, supported by Allied divisions, finally crack the weakened Austro-Hungarian Empire and push it out of Italy. A few days into the offensive, member states of Austria-Hungary began to declare independence, and the multicultural empire fell apart. A general retreat was ordered by the High Command, and on the 3rd of November the Armistice of Villa Giusti was signed, ending the war on the Italian front the next day. At the same time as the Vittorio Veneto battle, the French and American forces were pushing the Germans back in the Meuse-Argonne offensive on the Western Front. 2 days after the ceasefire in Italy on the 6th of November, Sedan and its critical railroad hub was captured. These severe losses during the Allied offensives, together with the surrender of their last Central Powers ally, led to the German Empire requesting an armistice, which was finally signed on the 11th of November. In December 1915, the Allies held the Second Chantilly Conference and agreed that all their armies on different fronts should coordinate their attacks on the Central Powers to hinder them from sending reserves from one front to another. In accordance with the Chantilly Agreement, the Russian commander of the southwestern front of the Imperial Russian Army, General Alexei Brusilov, planned a massive offensive against the Austro-Hungarians in Galicia for the summer of 1916. The aim of Brusilov's offensive was to ease the pressure on the Allied armies in France and Italy and hopefully force Austria-Hungary out of the war. Germany's furious attack on the Verdun Heights in February 1916 took the French by surprise, and the hellish fighting soon consumed the bulk of the French army. Marshal Joffre requested that the Russians hasten their plans to the east to draw German forces away from Verdun, and on June 4th, Brusilov attacked along a 250-mile front in Galicia. Using revolutionary artillery and shock troop tactics, the Russians broke through the Austro-Hungarian defences and secured more ground than any other offensive of the war, but at a tremendous loss of lives on both sides. As planned, Germany was forced to transfer substantial resources from Verdun to counter the Russians, aiding the French defence. Austria-Hungary too had to pull troops from the Italian front, but the Brusilov offensive had severely crippled the dual monarchy for the rest of the war. Shortly after the Ottoman Empire's entry into World War I on the 29th of October 1914, the British Empire sent a fleet of British and Indian troops to the Persian Gulf to attack the Ottoman fortress of Fao and secure British oil fields and facilities in the region. After capturing Fao on November the 8th, the British troops advanced rapidly along the river Tigris against light Turkish resistance, and by late September they had taken the town of Kut al-Amara, 120 miles south of Baghdad. Spurred on by the victories against the seemingly weak Ottoman Empire, Allied naval forces attacked the Dardanelles Strait on the 19th of February 1915, attempting to force their way to the Ottoman capital of Constantinople. But after several Allied ships were damaged or sunk by Turkish mines and coastal guns, the Allies landed troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 25th of April to secure passage for the ships. The Ottomans defended fiercely, and the Gallipoli campaign turned into an 8-month-long stalemate, with the Allies finally evacuating the peninsula in January 1916. In Mesopotamia, the British expected to capture Baghdad without much difficulty, but instead they were defeated at the town of Ctesiphon in late November 1915 and forced to retreat to Kut. The Ottomans encircled Kut and besieged the town, and after several failed British attempts at relief, the British forces there finally surrendered on the 29th of April 1916. After Gallipoli, the British Empire was shocked at their second major defeat by the Ottomans. The British instead reinforced their troops in Egypt and pushed the Ottomans further away from the Suez Canal into the Sinai Desert throughout 1916, supported by the Arab Revolt in the Hijaz. The British pushed into Gaza in early November 1917 and captured Jerusalem in December. They sent reinforcements to Mesopotamia too and resumed the advance up the Tigris, recapturing Kut in late February 1917 and taking Baghdad in March. The initiative was clearly back with the British, who kept pushing deeper into the Ottoman heartland, both in Palestine and Mesopotamia throughout 1918. On the 30th of October 1918, the Ottoman Empire agreed to an armistice, which ended the war in the Middle East after 4 years of fighting under horrible conditions of heat, thirst, and rampant disease. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned between Britain and France into borders that are still disputed to this day. Cape Helles, which lies at the foot of the Gallipoli Peninsula, was the main landing zone for the Anglo-French amphibious operation on April 25, 1915. Under the covering fire of the Royal Navy's guns, the British 29th Division was to storm the beach, overcome the stunned Ottoman defenders, and seize the dominating heights of Achi Baba. However, the Ottoman defenders were deeply entrenched on the cliffs and at the top of the hill. Concealed machine guns and artillery from behind the walls of Fort Zed al-Bahr opened fire on the landing parties, who were slowed to a crawl by barbed wire and the knee-high water. Boats were blown out of the water, and the survivors were forced into cover on the far side of the beach, where a few combat-ready platoons were finally able to establish a front line. The heights of Achi Baba Hill dominated the Gallipoli Peninsula and were the prime objective for the landing Allies. The Ottoman defenders had dug in around the village of Krithia and prepared camouflaged machine gun and artillery nests. From the heights, the defenders could direct their fire on the landing zones, and every attempt to seize their positions would be an uphill struggle against an entrenched defender. For Sir Ian Hamilton, Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force, the hill with its slopes reaching towards the Aegean and the Dardanelles represented the major obstacle on his way to success, and he ordered several infantry attacks to seize its crest. They all failed. The hill remained in Ottoman hands at the cost of several thousand Allied casualties. The first major Ottoman battle of the war, the Battle of Sarıkamış against the Russians in January 1915, resulted in catastrophe for the Ottomans, and afterward the British thought that taking Constantinople and knocking the Ottomans out of the war would be an easy task. So easy, in fact, that the 1915 Dardanelles operation was referred to as a cruise through the Sea of Marmara. But that offensive, Gallipoli, failed, as the British army was stymied again and again until the attacks were finally called off after 8 months and casualties in the hundreds of thousands. When, just a few short months later, the British surrendered an entire army to the Ottomans at Kut al-Amara on the Tigris River, the British Army, the nation, and even Winston Churchill, the initial impetus behind the Dardanelles operation, knew that the Ottoman Empire was anything but a pushover and that they were a formidable enemy armed with modern weaponry. Churchill received heavy criticism for his role in the Dardanelles operation and left his post as First Lord of the Admiralty for the Western Front to lead a battalion there. But the two military failures were a real blow to British morale in general, and High Command realised that hubris does not win battles in modern war. Ottoman morale, on the other hand, soared as the empire rallied around Mustafa Kemal, the new national hero after his leadership at Gallipoli, who would one day be known as Ataturk, the founder and first president of Turkey. The British would, however, learn from their mistakes, and 1917 and 1918 would see great British successes in the Middle East. The Battle of Heligoland BIGHT on August 28, 1914, was the first naval battle of the war as the British High Fleet engaged German patrols in the North Sea. The British aimed not only to ambush the German cruisers, but also to draw in the German fleet to a decisive battle and destroy as many enemy ships as possible. Germany lost several ships in the battle, as small skirmishes and duels between single cruisers and destroyers were fought, and barely escaped a catastrophe only by poor communications on the British side. Scarred by that experience, German naval strategy changed to a defensive stance for most of the war, judging that their fleet was outgunned in a straightforward engagement with the Royal Navy. The Battle of Jutland in 1916 served only to confirm this judgment. Most dangerous for the British war effort in the North Sea were the German submarines, mine layers and torpedo boats that were launched from Bruges in German-occupied Belgium. In its protected harbour, those vessels made their way through the canal and exited into the North Sea via the ports of Zeebrugge and Ostend. The German defences had 4 batteries of heavy guns with a range of 41 kilometres, and many smaller mobile artillery guns dominated the Belgian coastline. Additionally, the German Flanders Marine Corps was stationed close by and ready to engage at all times, but the Allies planned to block or destroy the locks of Zeebrugge and end the German submarine threat once and for all. The plan of the operation, which would be known as the Zeebrugge Raid, was to silence the coastal batteries and then scuttle several concrete-laden cruisers in the entrance to the canal. On April 23, 1918, 2 of the 3 scuttle ships were sunk in the canal, but they were sunk in the wrong place, and after a few days, German submarines were back in action. By early 1918, German High Command was acutely aware of the looming war of attrition the influx of fresh American troops on the Western Front would spark. Fortuitously, the Russian Revolution had ended Germany's war in the East, allowing thousands of seasoned German troops to be transferred back to the Western Front. Chief Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff therefore decided on a massive offensive, Kaiserschlacht, in spring 1918 in hopes of a decisive victory. The first attack, Operation Michael, launched in the Somme region on the 21st of March and began with a colossal hurricane bombardment, followed by elite stormtroopers. The aim was to break through the Allied lines and push the British Army back to the Channel ports, leaving France alone and forced to sue for peace. Although the Germans pushed further in the west than anyone had since 1914, almost reaching the British railway hub of Amiens, the attack eventually outran its artillery and supply lines and so lost all impetus. Ludendorff launched subsequent offensives as part of Kaiserschlacht, and on the 27th of May, Germany attacked the French at the Chemin de Dam Ridge, intending to draw British troops from the north and renew the original offensive in Flanders. Again, the German stormtroopers pushed the Allies far back, reaching the River Marne and getting within 56 kilometers of Paris. German victory seemed imminent, but like before, they had advanced beyond their own supplies and were exhausted. Building on the ground gained at the Marne, the final attack of Kaiserschlacht began on the 15th of July, but this time the French had set up a defense in depth. The German artillery barrage landed on empty trenches, with the actual Allied defensive line further back and untouched, and as the Germans advanced close to it, they were in turn met by heavy artillery fire. The German attack was thwarted, and now the initiative passed to the Allies. On July the 18th, Allied Supreme Commander Foch launched a massive counterattack with French, American, British and Italian troops behind a sudden rolling barrage, accompanied by 350 tanks and many aircraft. This was the beginning of the end, soon followed by the Allied 100 Days Offensive, which relentlessly pushed the Germans back until the November 11th armistice. In the spring of 1917, the German unrestricted submarine warfare campaign had raised serious concerns in British High Command. 12 British and French divisions were gathered that summer to attack the German Fourth Army near the small Belgian village of Passchendaele, to break through and force the Germans to abandon their submarine bases on the Belgian coast. The Battle of Passchendaele, also known as the Third Battle of Ypres, began on July 31, 1917, with an artillery barrage of over 4 million shells, which not only obliterated the German forward defences, but also destroyed the drainage system of the whole region. The initial infantry attacks took the remnants of the front lines from the stunned defenders with relative ease, but the German army was now fighting in a multi-layered flexible defence grid, consisting of mutually supporting strongpoints and shell-proof pillboxes that withstood large breakthrough attempts. Specially trained German counterattack troops engaged the British and prevented any real advance. General Herbert Plumer answered with small, locally confined bite-and-hold attacks, which efficiently focused on capturing and destroying the German strongpoints. However, the autumn rain soon turned the blasted battlefield into a sodden, muddy swamp, in which men and horses could sink, never to surface again. Like the Somme, this battle deteriorated into a horrifically bloody battle of attrition, and, again like the Somme, it was the impeding winter that ended the struggle, shortly after the British capture of the decimated village of Passchendaele. The 11th Battle of the Isonzo River in the summer of 1917 had left the Austro-Hungarian front lines dangerously weak, to the point where they might not withstand another Italian offensive. So with an initial plan to merely stabilise the front and allow their allies the time to reorganise, German High Command assigned 7 divisions with elite shock and Alpine troop detachments to General Otto von Below for an offensive on a 25-kilometre-long salient at Tolmino, close to the village of Caporetto in the Isonzo River Valley. On the misty morning of October 24th, a short but violent barrage of high explosive and chlorine and phosgene gas shells exploded on the Italian positions in the valley. The outdated gas masks of the Italian soldiers were of little use against the attack, and the sudden bombardment caused panic and confusion. That panic opened the gaps for the elite German units, who began slipping through and behind Italian lines. Small groups armed to the teeth with hand grenades, flamethrowers and light machine guns outflanked the Italian strongpoints on the steep hills suddenly emerging from behind. With the Italian centre breaking, the Austro-Hungarian Fifth Army under General Borjovik von Bojna was able to advance in a pincer movement from the south, turning the attack into a rout. Over 300,000 prisoners and most of the Italian artillery were taken within a few days as the Austro-German forces advanced dozens of kilometres. The remnants of the Italian army finally established new defensive positions at the Piave River. It was initially planned as a joint Franco-British attack to deny the German army the initiative on the Western Front. But as 1916 unfolded, British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig needed to take some pressure off the French army as they tried to stem the German tide at Verdun. A new attack in unison with Allied offensives on the eastern and Italian fronts could thwart the Central Powers' ability to relocate reserves between their fronts and eventually lead to a decisive breakthrough. For the Western Front attack, 13 British and 5 French divisions were chosen to attack the German Second Army on both sides of the River Somme. The vicious preliminary bombardment on June 24th by 1,500 heavy guns and howitzers was supposed to destroy the German positions entirely, but many shells were ineffective in the muddy terrain and failed to cut the German barbed wire. As the British and French soldiers went over the top on July 1st, the German defenders rose from their dugouts and brought their guns to bear. While the French assault south of the river took the Germans off guard, the British in the north were held up by fortified bunkers and barbed wire and took tremendous casualties from alert defenders. Heavy fighting for the smallest amount of ground in multiple renewed offensives forced the Germans to transfer reinforcements from Verdun to the Somme. But the Somme became a bloody battle of attrition. And though the newly constructed Mark I tanks were sent into battle to tip the scales and had great shock value, they were extremely unreliable and unable to make a difference. Winter ended the struggle on November 18th, with the Entente gaining 12 kilometers of ground for over 600,000 casualties. 1871, France had suffered a humiliating defeat to Prussia and vowed that it would never happen again. To that end, France and Russia were fast allies in the fight to contain German ambitions. France had vastly expanded its rail network, so in case of an attack, soldiers could easily be transported from place to place, and indeed did fight the entire war on its own territory. France learned quickly that old ideas did not work in modern war. They lost 28,000 men in a single day, marching in formation in bright red uniforms against German machine guns. For France, the war was a struggle for survival against its most hated enemy. The two sides in the war were two alliances of empires. The central powers were the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The Entente powers, today often referred to as the Allies, were composed of many more nations and featured the British and Russian empires, two of the three largest empires in world history, who ruled more than a third of the world between them. Before the war, though, the alliances had been somewhat different. The Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy was counterbalanced by the Franco-Russian alliance, and most people believed that these alliances would prevent war. They were wrong.